special guest from Caribbean Development Bank, presenters. It's indeed an honor to be here today because we know that we've been busy for quite some time to have Suriname join the bank. And we know that it happened last year. And we have seen that in the past month a lot of work has been done. Of course, it's a complete new path we want to go, and we want to explore all the new opportunities that membership of the Caribbean Development Bank will bring to Suriname. Allow me to say some special remarks in Dutch. Ik denk dat het onderwerp vandaag, public-private partnership, een heel belangrijke is, omdat natuurlijk is Suriname een van de oudere landen die een groot public-private partnership heeft uitgevoerd. We realiseren het ons te weinig, maar het bouwen van de stuwdam een hele tijd geleden, begin jaren 60, eigenlijk eind 50 jaar, is eigenlijk een public-private partnership geweest, waarbij het land samen met een multinational een groot project heeft uitgevoerd, waarvan we dus vandaag nog steeds de nodige benefits van hebben. Dus in principe heeft Suriname heel lang geleden, langer dan 50 jaar, kennis gemaakt met hoe public-private partnerships kunnen werken. In de ontwikkeling van de gezondheidssector zijn er ook wat kleinere public-private partnership projecten geweest. Een van ze is volgens mij de bouw van het diakonessenziekenhuis geweest. En ook bij het Sint-Vicentius ziekenhuis zijn er wat zaken geweest waarbij dat mogelijk was. Zo ziet u dus dat toch wel gebieden zijn waar het heeft gewerkt. Over het algemeen worden public-private partnerships projecten gezocht in het bouwen van wegen, infrastructuur, grote infrastructurele werken. Maar je kan het ook zoeken in hele kleine joint ventures eigenlijk, waarbij de overheid zaken kan outsourcen naar particulieren. Ik wil u een voorbeeld geven. Een van die zaken is natuurlijk het opzetten van het keuringlokaal, waarbij auto's die vroeger werden gekeurd, uitsluitend door de politie, op een bepaald moment eigenlijk is geprivatiseerd, onder toezicht nog steeds van de overheid. En we hebben dus dan private keuringslokalen gehad. We zien ze niet zozeer als public-private partnership projecten. En toch denk ik dat er daar een heleboel te doen is. Meestal kijken we naar energieprojecten en er is een heleboel braakliggend terrein wanneer je gaat met duurzame energie. Vooral als het gaat om solar, maar ook hydro. En ik denk dat we straks iets meer horen over hydro. Tegelijkertijd zien we ook dus dat vaak international heeft men gezien dat maintenance, en ik wil Winston geen gras voor de voeten weghalen, maar hij zal dadelijk praten over wat voorbeelden. Maar ik kan u zeggen dat we realiseren ons niet, maar die health sector die ondergaat op dit moment een behoorlijke public-private partnership, doordat dadelijk, of niet dadelijk, nu al, gaat iedereen verplicht zijn om verzekerd te zijn, waarbij een heleboel gaat naar de ziekenhuizen over mensen die de gezondheidssector gaan managen en de kosten die dus waarschijnlijk door het ministerie van Sociale Zaken minder te managen waren, dat we straks dat zien dat dat verzekerd wordt en outgesourced wordt. En in zekere zin kan je ook zien dat dat een public-private partnership is. Er zijn wat voorbeelden en er is heel veel te doen. En dat kan in hele kleine projecten. En we nodigen u uit om te kijken. En niet alleen te kijken naar die grote projecten, want over het algemeen denken we dat als de overheid een project moet doen, dan zou het alleen maar grote projecten moeten zijn. Maar kijk u naar de melkcentrale, hoe dat een keer is opgezet, waarbij boeren hun melk moesten aanleveren tegen een gegarandeerde prijs, waarbij de melkcentrale de melk doorverwerkte. Dus soms kunnen het coöperaties zijn, soms kunnen het samenwerkingsverbanden zijn, maar basically gaan we ervan uit dat de ondernemers een aantal dingen beter kunnen, efficiënter kunnen beheren, waarschijnlijk ook de maintenance, en in een goed samenwerkingspad kan dat gebeuren. Maar nogmaals, we hebben de experts hier om daarover te praten. Ik ben bijzonder verheugd dat wij de Griffin Development Bank hier hebben in Suriname. En het lijkt erop dat ze dus vast verzekerd zijn om hier zaken te doen. En ze zullen voor dit jaar, I think that this year you have planned more mission to come to Suriname. We want you to get involved in all segments of our economy and give all the new opportunities that are possible to our business community, but also for the government to show them the opportunities that your bank have to offer. It's not easy, not simple. Partnership is difficult, so when it gets public-private, it's not necessarily easier, but we're looking at public-public partnership, we're looking at public-private partnership, and you can have public-private partnership with more partners, so more public partners and more private sector partners. And partnership is based on trust, so that's very important. And when you do that, it's very good to have also the right formula to have that trust embedded in good safety contracts. And I think in that regard, Caribbean Development Bank can show you some good example. But let me welcome you all and wish you very fruitful evenings. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. And we're now going to get into the presentations by our panelists. And we're going to start off with Dr. Justin Ram. Like I told you before, he's the Director of Economics at the Caribbean Development Bank. Let's welcome Dr. Ram.
Okay, thank you very much, Colin. Your Excellency, Vice President Amirali, other members, other panelists, ladies and gentlemen, welcome once more to the second of two seminars that we are having here in Suriname today. The first, some of you would have attended this morning, was on the green economy. How can we transition our traditional forms of economic activity into one that is a lot more sustainable, and hence actually promoting the use of more renewable energy, as it were. I think that both of these seminars are quite interlinked, because we are seeing now that if we are to transform our economies into ones that are much more sustainable, while we need to be engaging in much more greener and sustainable forms of technology and modes of production, we also need to start advocating for the greater use of private sector resources, whereby the private sector can be utilized to assess the risks, as it were, in various project implementation, and thereby hopefully encouraging some greater level of efficiency, as it were, in our day-to-day lives. So this seminar this evening is meant to actually distill some of the findings from a recent research which the Caribbean Development Bank undertook on public-private partnerships in the Caribbean. I will give you a brief summary as to what some of those findings were from that report. But then I think the other two presenters will probably be a lot more fascinating than what I can present to you. They will actually present on actual examples, real-life examples of how public-private partnerships can work for you. So I'll be looking forward to those presentations after mine. So let me just go straight into the presentation, as it were. This way. So here's the outline of the presentation. I'll just go through with you very briefly as to why public-private partnerships could be a really good initiative and a way forward for many Caribbean economies, including that of Suriname. I'll go through with you some of the infrastructure requirements that we have ascertained that will be required in the Caribbean, including Suriname, over the next 10 years. What are the funding requirements? Go through with you the case for PPPs, the opportunities and risks associated therefore. Where we see the Caribbean Development Bank role in this, and then of course examples of PPPs in the Caribbean, which I'm likely to leave. I'm not going to dwell too much on the examples because the other two presenters will be presenting on those. So let me just give you an overall. If you look at the membership of the Caribbean Development Bank, the 19 borrowing member countries, as it were, all are relatively quite well endowed in terms of the per capita incomes. And here we found, I don't know what's going on there. So if we look at this, we can see that Caribbean economies are upper middle to high income economies, ranging from Cayman Islands, which is around 13th in the world, at a per capita income, and this is in purchasing power parity of just under $50,000 US, as it were. Now these numbers might look a bit strange to you because if you were to look at the Surinamese per capita income, you might think, well, hold on a minute, isn't it much lower than this? Well, this is what we call purchasing power parity. So if you were to spend a US dollar in Suriname and you were to spend that dollar in Trinidad and Tobago, we're looking at what that dollar can buy for you in both of those countries. So I put these statistics up for you to say that, you know what, within the Caribbean there's a lot of opportunity, as it were, for us to have much greater regional linkages, and the potential for opening up our markets are quite real when we look at the overall per capita income within these countries. I put down here at the bottom the top ranked country, as it were, and this was in 2011, of Qatar, of course boosted by its huge natural resource wealth of a per capita income of about just under $150,000, as it were. And Singapore, a small country that we tend to always try to compare many of our Caribbean economies to, which has a per capita income of about $72,000. Now, what's been happening in Caribbean development countries? What's been the growth experience? We have found that many of our borrowing member countries, the growth rate has not been stellar, as it were. Suriname has been doing a lot better, but when we look at the average over all of the Caribbean borrowing member countries, we have been underperforming many of our comparator countries. Here, so we've been underperforming world growth, emerging and developing countries. Other small island developing states have averaged about 4%, while, for example, over the last decade, CDB's growth, borrowing member countries' growth, has only averaged about 3%. And it's telling us something that perhaps there's something wrong with the structure of our economies. What is that? And we are starting to believe that perhaps we now need to start encouraging greater private sector involvement within the economy to change that overall structure. Again, this is just another chart showing you how borrowing member countries have been compared to other comparator regions around the world. Now, because many of the countries have not been performing well, as it were, in terms of their growth rates, we found that levels of debt have been increasing significantly. And that has meant that the credit ratings of many of our countries have been going in the wrong direction. They have been going negative, as it were. Now, when this tends to happen, it means that government's ability to borrow in the international market or even domestically is constrained, but constrained to the point whereby the cost of borrowing increases. And so what we're saying here is that if governments are having difficulties in borrowing, how are they going to finance their infrastructure requirements, as it were? And hence the reason for us discussing the possibility of utilizing public-private partnerships in a real way going forward. I should point out here that Suriname has had a stable rating, as it were, and that is actually good news. Suriname's debt to GDP ratio is actually very well managed, and you must be commended for that. Now, with countries becoming ever more indebted, and with the possibility that growth will continue, we will expect that over time, as per capita incomes increase, there will be a greater demand for infrastructure services. We expect that infrastructure services, the demand for infrastructure services will grow as per capita incomes increase. If we look at some of these statistics as well, we look at electricity tariffs across the Caribbean. Suriname and Trinidad and Tobago at the bottom here, where you can see that electricity tariffs are quite low in comparison to many of the other Caribbean countries. Look at, for example, in Turks and Caicos, where they're paying almost 51 cents, US cents per kilowatt hour. It is almost impossible for many of our foreign member countries to compete with such high rates of electricity tariffs. Suriname and Trinidad and Tobago are fine because, of course, these countries do have indigenous resources by which they utilize to produce their own electricity. But for those countries that do not have those resources, we find that the electricity tariffs are quite high. So it's telling us that perhaps we know that we need to be investing more in cheaper, perhaps renewable forms of electricity if we are to spur greater economic growth in the future. I'm showing you these statistics so that you can get a sense as to why there perhaps might be a problem with economic growth in many of our countries. Here again is the average time required to get electricity. In Guyana in 2013 it was 109 days, and that went down to about 18 days in St. Kitts and Nevis. In Suriname, the average time to get electricity from when you first apply is around 58 days to around 60 days or therefore. If we look at the doing business indicators around the world, we'll find that many of our Caribbean countries are not performing as well as some of our competitors globally. In Singapore, it will take much less time to get electricity from when you first apply for it. So I'm painting the picture that there needs to be a change in the way we do business, and this might need to, we might need to encourage greater private sector involvement there. What about road infrastructure? In this study, we looked at what is actually the demand for road capacity in many of our foreign member countries. And here you can see that we do have a database, as it were, as roads per kilometer per 1,000 individuals within society. Here, so we can see that from Antigua, we have 14.6 roads per kilometer. In Barbados, we have about 5.9 roads per kilometer per 1,000 persons. Trinidad and Tobago is 6.6. And in Suriname, we have about 8.8 roads per kilometer per 1,000 individuals. If we were to look down at the bottom here, we can see, well, how are we comparing to some of our comparators as we go? Roads per kilometer in Asia, in East Asia and the Pacific, where it's about 3.2 kilometers. In Europe, it's about 5.3, and Latin America and the Caribbean, it's about 5.7. Now remember that we're looking at this in terms of per capita. So some of our Caribbean countries are actually performing fairly well here. While, for example, if we look at countries where the populations are much larger, we are actually seeing that we are outperforming many of those countries. But it's not to say that we do not need to improve our road infrastructure in the Caribbean. Okay? And here the statistic that looks at paved roads as a percentage really tells us something quite stark. So that overall in Suriname, here, the paved roads as a percentage of overall roads is only 2%, while, for example, in East Asia and Pacific, it's up to 66%. So it's telling us that there is really a great need for infrastructure upgrade in many of our countries. What about water resources? I thought I would pull out these statistics because these are quite stark for many of our board member countries. But for countries like Guyana and Suriname, where there's a lot of fresh water available, it is not such a bad statistic. So considerable infrastructure investment will be required over the next 10 years or so as the economies grow, and we are estimating that over the next 10 years we need a total investment of about $21.4 billion in road transportation, in electricity generation and transmission, as well as in the provision of sanitary and water services. And out of that, we are expecting that the governments can finance some of it, but there was likely to be a financing gap of about almost $11 billion. And where is that money going to come from? And here it is that we're suggesting that perhaps public-private partnerships might be the way to go. So this just gives you a distribution of that investment and the overall gap that is required. The majority of the investment needs to go into the electricity and transmission sector, as it were, followed not very closely, followed by water and sanitation, and then by transport, as it were. And here we can see the chart on the right-hand side shows us the private investment that is likely to be needed in this area as well. So this is just another table which shows you the total public and private investment that is needed by country and by the three sectors. And here I can identify for you, for Suriname, we're expecting that in electricity, perhaps an investment of around 270 million might be required. In transport, about 50 million, as it were. And in water and sanitation, about 150 million. So this came out of the study that we did, sort of a demand analysis, as it were, over the next few years as to what type of investment would be required. Quite interestingly, that at the top of the table there is Haiti, where we expect there to be considerable need for investment in these three sectors. So the case for PPPs. I'm sorry, I'm not sure what has happened here, but the case for PPPs. Now, we believe that if you utilize public-private partnerships in a real way, you can have the lowest whole life service cost across the life cycle of the project. And here, I'm not going to go into much detail, but perhaps we can discuss this later on. PPPs can have on-time and on-budget asset delivery, as it were, and also provide capital resources and revenues from user fees. I think that last point is quite significant, so that PPPs can help pay the actual asset or project can pay for itself because it now generates user fees for its use. And again, the case for PPPs. I'm not going to read all of this, as it were, but it allows us to mobilize private capital resources for the provision of public infrastructure. And again, as I mentioned before, the additional revenues from the collection of user fees is quite an important aspect of PPPs, which we must not underlook. And this final point here, I think, is very useful, because when we have partnerships with the private sector for the provision of a public good, as it were, the private sector has the incentive, as it were, to ensure that that asset is fully utilized. And here I provide the example of SAMSA International Airport in Montego Bay in Jamaica, which has been where a public partnership arrangement has been in place for a number of years now. And what we have found there is that the ambience, the efficiency of the airport has improved, but because the owner is now a private entity, they have all the incentives to ensure that there's a lot of throughput of tourists, as it were, through that airport. And that is very good for the overall Jamaican economy and very good for the Montego Bay tourism sector, as it were. So what we're seeing here is that there's a real win-win scenario here when PPPs are utilized in the right way. Again, here, because of we know the increased risk associated with climate change, we believe that public-private partnerships can help us to increase climate resilience. And here in the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead, but we can discuss some of these things later on during the question and answer session. Interestingly enough, public-private partnerships can also be used to advance the social agenda, as it were. So here, public-private partnerships are being looked at, for example, in Trinidad and Tobago, for the delivery of educational facilities. Yes? Public-private partnerships can also be used for the management and operation of those educational services, as well as the delivery of the educational services as well. So what we're trying to say here is that there needs to be a change in mindset. For many of our countries, we have often and historically thought that many of the social services should only be provided by the government, as it were. But what we have found that in many instances, those services have not been delivered in an efficient manner. And can we now utilize the public-private partnerships to help us improve our efficiency and deliver those services at much greater value for money for our taxpayers and ultimately the users of those services? So what are the types of public-private partnership contract types that we can have here? Here I provided you, but this is all provided within the report. We can have operation and maintenance type public-private partnerships, operation, maintenance, and management. We can have a sale and then a lease back, so a sale to the private sector and then a lease back by perhaps from the private entity back to the public sector. We can have lease purchase arrangements, or we can have build, own, operate, and then transfer the asset to the state. Whereby in all of these instances, what we are trying to do is to spread the risk of these enterprises, as it were. Because the private sector has a greater ability to assess the risk and so to bring greater efficiency into the decision-making matrix, as it were. Again, we can have build, own, lease, transfer. We can have design, build, operate, and maintain. Design, build, finance, operate, and maintain. And the list goes on. There are different types of contractual arrangements that are available for public-private partnership, and it all depends on the type of asset and service that you are wanting to provide for the population. So PPPs, there are of course a real necessity to have certain factors in place before PPPs can be considered to be critical, as it were, and helping us in financing many of the infrastructure gaps that we have in the Caribbean at the moment. Let's go along here. So from some early lessons of PPPs in the Caribbean, we have found that PPPs tend to add most value when, of course, the asset or service is easily defined. That's first of all. Secondly, when there's a market appetite for this, because what tends to happen here, we're now bringing the public asset, as it were, the public service, the provision of that public service into the marketplace. Are consumers willing to pay for that service, as it were? So there needs to be the appetite within the market for it. When there's a problem existing within an existing service delivery, as it were, which is not being delivered efficiently, if there's a profitability potential, then PPPs can be utilized. And then, of course, the project scale tends to justify the cost of PPP procurement and management. And here, this just gives us some indication as to how PPP contracts can be utilized, where it is you think you can utilize them, if you're thinking of moving away from greater public sector involvement in the provision of the service and the provision of the infrastructure to one of pure private, as it were. So we go all the way from service contracts down to completely to full-scale privatization, perhaps with some regulation by the state, and perhaps also some licensing and regulation, as it were. I'll be happy to discuss these. So what is required for us to have efficient and to strengthen the PPP policy and regulatory regime within our countries? So first of all, we need to develop the PPP policies and processes. We need to ensure that these are transparent and predictable. And so there needs to be buy-in across the political spectrum, as it were, if PPPs are to be successful. So we need to have the appropriate legal and regulatory environment, robust institutional capacity, and I'm sure that the other presenters will tell you a bit more about this. And I can't emphasize again how important it is to have the right people on board when you are negotiating PPP contracts, as it were. Because if you don't negotiate these things properly, PPPs can actually come back and bite you, as it were. So it's very important to have the requisite skills on board. And of course, the fiscal management and accounting frameworks. You have to ensure that if you're engaging in a public-private partnership, and the reason for doing so is to ensure that perhaps the debt is not on the government's books, then how that PPP is structured and implemented will be very, very important. So again, this just is some elements of a sound fiscal plan for PPPs. I'm not going to speak about this too much now. We can speak about that later on. But there is and I have to be honest with you, there is a risk associated with PPPs if they are not structured properly, and how we account for them on the balance sheet of the government would be very important as well. So what's the Caribbean Development Bank doing here? Just to tell you, so we are just about ready to establish a PPP unit within the bank. And the reason for that is that we think that we can bring economies of scale to bear for many of our board member countries. We don't think that there are sufficient PPP projects in all of our countries to warrant the establishment of individual PPP units within each of our countries. So we are now establishing one at the Caribbean Development Bank, whereby we can harness the experience of PPP experts for the benefit of all of our board member countries. And I'm pleased to say that we've just recently chosen a coordinator for that unit, and that person should be starting with the bank early next month, as it were. We are here, we're supporting sustained capacity building at the country level and promoting the improvements in the regulatory environments. And here at the Caribbean Development Bank, we provide policy-based loans, as it were, to allow you to set up the regulatory environment to promote PPPs. Provide a platform for active and sustained dialogue and lessons of experience across the Caribbean. There have been some countries in the Caribbean that have a very good history of utilizing PPPs. Jamaica in particular, Guyana you will hear from soon. And then there are some other countries that are looking to utilize PPPs for the greater provision of public services and infrastructure. And of course, with the Caribbean Development Bank, there is always access to funding, as it were, for public-private partnerships as we go forward. Okay, I'm not going to speak too much about the examples, because I think the next couple of presenters will say a lot more about those. So that's it in a nutshell. That's a brief summary of the research that we undertook earlier this year on public-private partnerships. And I'll be very happy to take your questions and comments towards the end. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. His Excellency, Vice President Amarali, members of the head table, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here in Suriname. In fact, I just arrived about 2 hours ago, and I'm going back very early in the morning. Forgive me, but I'm going to more or less present a presentation that I did earlier this year in Guyana at the CDB annual meeting. So for those of you who were there, I do apologize if what you've seen before. I'm going to go through very quickly. I'm going to go through 3 projects. One that's already been completed, our Berbice Bridge, which is a good project. One that's currently under construction, the Marriott Hotel project, which is more a joint venture type project. And the Amilo Falls Hydro project, which we are hoping will start by the third quarter of next year, start construction. When I finish those, I'll speak quickly to what our experience has been in terms of opportunities and challenges and other projects we have in the pipeline. By way of background, as we get into PPPs, we need to recognize that the state of the economy and the institutional capability needs to be at a certain level. In Guyana, which was going socialist in the 70s and 80s and then reoriented its trajectory in the early 1990s, we had a lot of, the state more or less dominated the country. And so we started a major privatization program. In fact, I've been involved in privatization for a little over 20 years. Having successfully completed a number of those, we then started looking at other forms of privatization, and PPPs was the next area that we looked at. We recognized that the state sector has many demands placed in it, and the expansion of infrastructure in other areas could best be done by PPPs. In Guyana, we've had a difficult period, but in the last few years we've been doing much better. In the early 1990s, the major portion of our income went towards debt service. Today, less than 6% of our income goes to debt service. Our debt to GDP is considerably down. We now have more fiscal resources, but we've learned our lessons from excess borrowing, and we're seeking to do as much as we can through the private sector. In the last 8 years, we've averaged economic growth of about 4.5% per annum. So even with the recession in 2009, the exchange rate has generally been stable, inflation under control, foreign reserves have been right here. So we've got a fairly stable environment. The interest rates are such that our lending rates for loans from our banking sector is probably in the range of about 10% or higher. Housing loans are a little cheaper. But our treasury bill rate is in the range of 2%. And having a low short-term interest rate actually helps when we're looking at these type of projects. Okay, moving on. Let's begin with what would probably be considered our first major PPP project, the Berbice Bridge. The Berbice Bridge, and this is a picture of it, it's a 1.55 kilometer bridge. The bridges are our Berbice River, which was previously serviced by a ferry. For many, many years, everyone was talking about it. We had a couple of false starts, but finally, in 2006, we achieved financial closure, and the bridge was opened in late 2008 by our former president, President Barrett Jackdale. For the part of the country that we call Berbice, it was something that has been long in the works. Now you can drive from Georgetown to the border of Suriname in probably 2 hours. And I've done it overland and taken the ferry. So these are all innovations that infrastructure networks being improved. More and more people will travel and be willing to spend go away. So if you haven't come to Guyana along the road and along the bridge, please let me encourage you. The the financing structure for the Berbice Bridge, it's a relatively small project. Now, this is a project structure, and it follows a traditional project finance structure. We have a special purpose company that we created. This company had investors, so you had common shareholders. We had corporate insurance companies, corporate investors, the national insurance scheme, and then we had different forms of debt. Now, the Burbage Bridge Company basically entered into a design-build contract with a European consortium, Bosch Rexroth, and the supervision was done by an international firm, and construction was about a little under 2 years. The company itself has its license or its concession issued pursuant to special purpose legislation. And so we have a concession agreement issued by the government to the company, which more or less sets out the rights of the company and the obligations of the government as grantor. The government, recognizing that raising this sort of money was not easy, agreed to build the access roads to the project outside of the project. So the private sector essentially built the bridge and owned and operated the bridge. And the approaches, which was about a little over 4 kilometers of new roads, were built by the government with funding from the IDB. The usual, in a project structure like this, we had all of the income and all of the inputs were tax-free, and that was embedded in the legislation. We had the land made available at very low rates. The concession agreement provided for the tolling policy, and this is very important, I'll come back to that. And of course the specs or of what the bridge had to be were specified, and all of the financing obligations. Now, some of the interesting aspects of this project was we basically created a bridge which took what used to be a 3-hour journey to a 3-minute journey. And we did it at materially the same tolls that were being used in the ferry. Although now sometimes this issue at home gets distorted a bit, because when you're going on the ferry, you would pay for the vehicle, then you would pay for each passenger, and you pay one way. Coming back, the same thing. With the bridge, you pay a round-trip ticket that covers both the vehicle and the passengers. But when we looked at the numbers and we showed people, it was materially the same as what they were paying using the ferry. In addition to that, we had studies, willingness to pay studies, that indicated that all users were willing to pay substantially more for the benefit of having a bridge. And so everyone was saying, we're going to pay more, we're willing to do more, we want the bridge for the convenience. When you actually get it, sometimes you end up in, you witness some level of politicking on what actually happened. And history is quickly forgotten. The company basically had a number of shareholders. There were no government guarantees. So this is a project where the government is not guaranteeing anything. Now, in big projects like this, there are 2 major areas of risk. One is your construction risk. Will the project be built on time within budget? And usually that risk you pass off to the contractor through liquidated damages and lump sum contracts. The next risk is what happens after the project is opened up. Where do you get the revenue to cover your O&M costs, which is generally a small portion of your revenue? But the majority of your money typically goes to repaying financing. And with no guarantees, you need to be satisfied that the toll structure will cover you. Now, your toll structure, and I'll do more on this, but within our concession agreement, we had a very detailed formula which provided for an annual adjustment of tolls based on looking at the previous historic performance for the last year. And this is not dissimilar to what you would see in, say, electricity regulation, a rate of return mechanism. The project had a 21-year concession, and it was projected that at the end of that period, the bridge will be fully repaired, and at the end of it, it will revert to the government at no cost. So essentially, this is largely a financing mechanism, but with private sector ownership and management during that period. As I mentioned, the bridge was opened in 2008. Now, driving your revenue structure is volumes and tolls. And so we did quite a bit of work to determine what was the makeup of this. We knew what the initial toll levels were based on the ferry. We had willingness to pay studies, and from this we projected toll levels. We had studies that also looked at the volume that would be generated, both from existing traffic, from organic growth, and from new created traffic as a result of the bridge. We made certain adjustments to that because feasibilities over time quickly change in assumptions. And we found the prudent level to have our revenue projected. So we did that here. Now, what I've done is to show what the tolls were on the ferry and what they were on the bridge. And the majority of your traffic tends to be your minibuses. In real terms, they're substantially lower. In nominal terms, they're lower in these categories. In fact, the majority of traffic is passenger vehicles. And the overall revenue from passenger vehicles went up substantially. What we found is we were charging for freight and so on, and people just started, instead of moving freight in freight vehicles, to put it in their own vehicle and move it. Their trunk, but generally, I think we did fairly well based on the numbers. The freight was down substantially, but our overall revenue was up. Now, what did we conclude from where we are? That whilst revenue was had, there was some substitution effect, depending on the type of vehicle. All right, so we found that we were doing overall better than projections. Now let me give you a current footnote to where everything is today. Our projected toll structure envisaged that around last year we would start to increase tolls, and it would go up maybe 10-15% over 3 years, and then it would come down. In real terms, it would be lower than what they were paying on the ferry. It would be considerably lower than what the willingness to pay studies were. The political realities turned out that there was significant political opposition to the tolls, and much of the technical details seem to have been lost. And so we haven't increased the tolls, and we're probably going to restructure some of the repayment schedules so that it's more flattened rather than going up and coming down. Because once you repay capital, you have less capital to pay interest in the back end of the project. You actually have a rapidly declining level of tolls. So we are looking at restructuring that a bit to avoid having to increase tolls but reduce the reduction that would come in the back end. We now go to the second project, which is our Marriott Hotel project currently under construction. And we're looking to have this open in February. Now, for many years we've been talking about it. Few people expected that we'll actually realize it. When we actually broke ground in 2011, there were significant objections from various special interests. pleased that we're moving ahead and the project will open next year, February. We've already hired a general manager. Now, what's interesting about this project is that it is a full Marriott hotel. And when we look around the region, Trinidad, Barbados, Jamaica, Suriname, they are mostly courtyards. Now, we have not had a major branded hotel come again in over 40 years, Pegasus Hotel being the last one. We do have the Princess Hotel and Casino, but they're more casino business. But when it comes to global brands, we haven't had one come. And these pictures are somewhat dated, they're about 5 days old. I'm sorry I didn't update it. A lot, this is quite different today. Now, basically, this will be a 200-room hotel almost. An entertainment complex that includes a casino, a nightclub, and a restaurant. And we're building a walkway, a concrete promenade that will connect the existing seawall to a pier. So we're improving the seaside. And the project will be LEED certified. Earlier this year, we issued a press release announcing the conclusion of the debt financing. We hired Republic Bank to raise $27 million US of the $60 million investment on a syndicated debt basis. They have completed that. We have signed all the agreements, and we're now waiting on the security documents to be advertised, the debenture and mortgage, and then we'll draw down. And after that, the investor comes in. And I say all of this because there are legal challenges that we've had to face seeking to stall the project. But the government has been steadfast in its commitment to the project, and we have upfronted the funding. We're putting 1/3 of the long-term financing, but we've had to bridge some of the additional funds. But the jobs that will be created with this project will be close to 400 when everything is finished. So it will create jobs pretty much for local people. We made the project feasible by, in essence, the casino business helped to cross-subsidize the hotel investment, left on its own, where your hotel feasibility is premised on comparable rates and comparable occupancies. The project would not have been financially feasible just as a hotel. So in Guyana, we passed legislation a few years ago, where basically, if you want a casino license, you have to build a new hotel of a certain high standard with a minimum of 150 rooms. That's how the Princess Hotel was built, just before World Cup cricket. This is how, and this is helping with this project. 58 million, highly leveraged deal, 46.5 million of debt. But we've structured our investment where if we were to wind up today, part of our investment would be treated as debt. But from a return perspective, in the early years, we give priority to let the private investor get up to a certain level of return, and then we look at the longer term. So we've taken a project with an IRR of 11%. We're borrowing most of it at the debt at 8%. The private investor return on equity over time, including residual value, will be high double digits, and the government return will be about 6%. Now, this is quite favorable because our deposit rate is only about 1-2%. So we're using this as a catalyst to create the investment. We're still better off as government. Without our investment, the project wouldn't happen. And once the project does better than projected, which we believe it will because we're using conservative projections prepared by Marriott, we think that we will get a faster payback. I now come to the third project, which is the most significant, our Mile Falls Hydro project. Now, the Burbage Bridge is done, the Marriott Hotel will open. In all of our projects in Guyana, we've had we've had challenges of many different types. But the political challenge sometimes could be considered the most significant. Amila is good for Guyana from a number of perspectives. It will reduce the cost of electricity. Our generation cost with fossil fuels, using last year average fuel rates, would be in the range of 19 cents a kilowatt hour. The hydro will allow us to reduce this to about 10 cents a kilowatt hour. And you know where most of the countries depend on fossil fuels, our rates of electricity tend to be quite high. In Guyana, our end user tariffs, what the customer actually pay, averages about 31 cents a kilowatt hour. And we have a significant level of theft of electricity that we're trying to address. But we will reduce the cost of generation by roughly half. In macro terms, this will allow us to save about 100 million US roughly in imported fuel, well, in foreign exchange, because we'll save about $200 million in imported fuel. No, we buy some of our fuel from Statsoli, but I know lately they've been doing very well. We will save 200 million in fuel, but we will pay about 100 million in the tolling fee. And at the end of 20 years, we own the project. We're adding 165 megawatts of capacity, which is enough to cover existing demand, organic growth, and add self-generators in parts of the country that currently are not on the grid. And it's going to be a model for climate financing. Now, I note this morning that you guys were speaking on the green economy. The Norwegian government has an agreement with the government where over 5 years, based on performance of protecting our forests, we can get up to $250 million. To date, we've earned about $150 million. The monies that are earned from these eco-services payments will then be channeled into development projects that are considered green. And a big chunk of this money, $80 million, is coming into the Amila Falls project through what they call a partner entity, which will be IDB in this case, who will confirm when the money comes that all of the environmental and appropriate safeguards are in place. But basically, it's going to be a model project because very few countries in one step can say they're moving from being almost entirely supplied by fossil fuel for electricity, fossil fuels, to being almost entirely supplied by renewable energy. And so this is what this project allows us to do. And based on our expectations, we expect this project to start next year. Last year we had some setbacks where the majority, the sponsor who was putting a little over 100 million of the 840 million withdrew because they wanted to have certain bits of legislation and agreements that were needed for the IDB. They wanted unanimous approval of our parliament. They were investing in a country where if the second major political party wasn't favoring the project, they were concerned about the political risk. They met with everybody, they said, we need this. They went to Parliament in the first go-round. The combined opposition rejected it. They came down, they spoke to the opposition. They went to Parliament again. The minority opposition supported it, so we got majority passage of what we needed, which would be sufficient to get it done in the ordinary course of business. But because Blackstone had said we want unanimous approval, they immediately withdrew. Since that time, we've been working to resuscitate the project because when you have partners working for 6 to 8 years on a major project like this, tremendous time and money, and as I think my Vice President said, partnerships is based on trust, and so you build relationships. And so recognizing all of that work was done, we're looking to get this back on track with the existing partners. The Chinese have said that if Site Global doesn't go forward, they will put the money in. And so that's an option on the table. And we feel confident based on where things are that sometime in the near future we'll be able to make announcements and that this project will start construction next year. A lot of these PPPs take a longer time to prepare than the actual construction of the project will take. The project is actually covering not just building the hydro plant and the reservoir, but transmission lines to bring the power to the load centers and access roads to get to the project. We're a huge country, 83,000 square miles. So this project is 270 kilometers southwest, and it's coming through some very difficult terrain. So we've had to build quite a lot of new roads into the rainforest to pass the transmission lines and be able to move the equipment. And those roads are pretty much complete already. See what a map looks like. So this is Georgetown. The project is just north of Kaito Falls. Project structure, very similar. Project structure again, special purpose company, investors, it wouldn't be site at this point. You have investors. The China Development Bank is lending over 500 million here, IDB over 100 million. Chinese money usually requires their own insurance, Sinosure. The project is being built by China Railway First Group. China Railway First Group is part of China Railway Group, publicly listed on the Hong Kong and Shanghai exchanges. They're the second largest construction company in the world, revenue of 83 billion. After the project is built, you'll have a O&M agreement. The government has various agreements such as licensing, permitting, and in a big project like this, which would be the single largest investment project in Guyana's history, the level of work that goes into the legal agreements is quite substantial. And all of the power will be purchased through a PPA by the Guyana Power and Light, and we will use a bank as a collateral agent on a receivables agreement to pay the Amila Falls company their money first. So our revenue comes into more or less a lockbox. The PPA payment gets taken out first. The rest of the money gets sent back to GPL for all the costs. 858 million, CDB over 500 million. In a project like this, the cost covers everything up to when you basically go commercial. So it will cover during your construction, your interest during construction, and with a 3 or 4 year construction period, this can be substantial. All of your development costs. So typically, you will be looking at the real hard cost of construction, probably being only about 70% of the total project cost. So you pretty much look at funding all of your costs up to the opening of the project as part of your capital structure. Now, so those are the 3 projects. Now let me try to sum up. I think I'm taking a little longer than planned. We have some experience with these projects. We're actually working with the IDB and their multilateral investment fund to promulgate what we call a white paper on public-private partnerships. Some of you may know in Jamaica they've just passed something like this, and they call it P4. So it's privatization and public-private partnerships. And I think it's out of DBJ. And basically that's the company that basically implements not just privatization but PPPs. We have tremendous domestic liquidity, equivalent to $1 billion US. But the bigger the projects are, the more likely that you will have to look for international investors and parties who will control it. Even though you may have the liquidity, prudent lending margin or lending limits will mean that they will only put a small portion of their capital into the project. And for many of these big projects, even if they're willing to invest, they're going to need a lead investor who will come in. So the Berbice Bridge was largely domestic, or pretty much all domestic. The Marriott Hotel project is a mixture of the two. The hydro project will be pretty much largely financed outside of Guyana initially. So the bigger the project, the greater the likelihood you'll need foreign funding. I think all of us in the region know very well that China has been up there willing to lend, willing to build. They're becoming our largest investor and financer in the region. Conclusion, we've been doing this for 10 years, but we've probably still got a lot to learn. We're now moving to define a framework. What you find, most countries will do this, and 5-10 years later, then they'll start to say, we want a structured framework or policy in how we do PPPs. We don't see it happening up front. And we have a lot of potential projects in our pipeline: a new bridge over the Mara River, dredging the port, deepwater port, road to Brazil, some huge hydros with Brazil, to name a few. So, ladies and gentlemen, I think I've taken a little longer than I should. Apologize. Thank you.
I also would like to address a special welcome to the Vice President, Mr. Amarali, and to the other ladies and gentlemen at presence. Here we will talk about the public-private partnership, but we will look at from a business forum standpoint. This is what my presentation will be about. We will look at public-private partnership, public-private dialogue, the Suriname Business Forum, and then we will talk about some PPP projects we have done in Suriname, and also do some recommendations. I have in my presentation, definition of public-private partnership is a cooperative venture between the public and the private sector, built on expertise of each partner, and that best meets clearly defined public needs through the appropriate allocation of resources, risk, and reward. The ultimate goal of a PPP is to obtain more value for money than traditional public procurements would deliver. But there's a big but. It has to be sustainable. And how can such a product be sustainable? This is the construction of the Suriname Business Forum. We have the business and the employers association, government and institutions, civil society organizations. The goals and duties of the Suriname Business Forum is to bring innovative and sustainable development of the local private sector by means of dialogue between the public and the private sector in a public-private partnership, in jointly formulating, implementing, and monitoring the national strategy. The Suriname Business Forum is the executive office of the Suriname Business Development Center, is the executive office of the Suriname Business Forum, and was established on November 18, 2008. We formulated a national strategy to develop the local private sector. It's a national strategy, and it is a strategy for 2011 to 2020. And when you have a plan, a national strategy plan, you also have to put it into action. That's why National Strategic Action Plan was formulated for 2011 to 2015 and is comprising of 88 actions. This is the structure of our National Strategic Action Plan 2011 and 2015. There are 6 core areas, and 88 actions are divided over these 6 core areas. Some PPPs projects in Suriname, the housing projects, based on public-private partnership. The government has partnered with private parties to develop site and build homes on these sites. It has already resulted in 3 special PPP projects, and the locations are Watalan, Leiding Tina, and Juliana. And these PPP projects involve a total construction of approximately 220 homes nationwide. The principles for this PPP were the availability of land at lower cost, the ability to achieve simultaneous residential complexes in different areas, the national character of the project. Less stress on the public sector is also business support and guidelines, rules, and supervision were in accordance with the National Housing Program. This is the picture of one of these projects, housing projects. We also had the so-called ringweg a few years ago. That's a road that the Johannes Vermeer Street in Turkana along the Bones Creek, and it's highly valued. It's a highly valued solution because of the traffic problem we had. The residents of the north side of Paramaribo had to go to the south of the city, had to go to very much traffic congestion, and it was so bad it took hours to cover a distance of less than 10 kilometers. The Port of Suriname is a very well-known project, and its current operational structure is very unique for the region, because most harbors are in the region are government-owned. But as you can see, the system of the port management is mainly that they are a network and the land infrastructure, and everything else to that, to 3 shipping companies. The port management had lease agreements with 3 private terminal operators. They facilitate them with utilities, and they have to come with their own equipment, approved by the port, of course, and maintenance. The formula works because, as we can see, our port has grown nearly tenfold in the last 10 years. It's also received the award of the best port in the Caribbean region. This is a picture of our port. The energy sector. Example of PPP in the energy sector we had in October, where Cermaq, a private company, has signed an agreement with the energy company of Suriname, and the project is that Cermaq will set up a substation that will rise along the Martin Luther King Road, and that's a total budget of 4.7 million. The substation will provide the ability to have sufficient energy for Cermaq and its new company that is going to set up, and also companies and individuals in the area will have enough energy at their disposal, because a part of the energy will not be used by Cermaq. This agreement can serve as an example for other businesses to invest in sustainable and reliable infrastructure. I did save this example for last because the Business Forum will start a PPP program with the Suriname Energy Company. We will write a project and give other companies the opportunities to benefit from such PPP deals. Companies that are able to invest in providing their energy will be given the opportunity to do so. Important is that the terms of such investment will be closely discussed with the energy company in Suriname. What we have to keep in mind, that PPP can be a solution in many sectors in Suriname and in the Caribbean, but we have to use private sector dialogue and partnership as a tool for private sector development. We have to make policy reforms easier to implement when entrepreneurs understand what the government is trying to achieve with reforms package, they are more likely to accept these reform packages. We have to build an atmosphere of mutual trust and understanding between public and private sector. The private sector has also to be well organized. Both public and private sector must be willing to contribute. We have to have a centrum to monitor all PPPs, a means of dialogue between public and private sector. As Mr. Justin Ram said earlier, that the Caribbean Development Bank is going to start a unit. I think it's also be very beneficial to the other country to have a PPP unit in their country. PPP can also be a solution when public and private sector public and private sector in Suriname and also in the Caribbean have to do an extensive study on PPP to better understand what the benefits can be, and to determine what the benefits can be for each what the best opportunities can be for each sector. All stakeholders, public and private, should be heading in the same direction. We have to take all the lessons learned into account, not only in Suriname but also lessons learned in the Caribbean. Rules and legislations must be clear to especially the private sector. PPP agreement have to be transparent and corruption-free, and the public sector has to take more of the advantages of PPP deals. We also have other PPP projects running, especially in the health sector, as Mr. Amarali mentioned, but also in our education sector, you have PPP deals. And lately, we also had a solar project set up by IM Gold, where they will have 5 megawatt for their company and local residents. I leave you with the night picture of Suriname, and thank you for your attention.